Why did boxing throw Wolgast in an asylum? Because a brain-damaged, bankrupt fighter is a liability. In 1910, he made millions for the cartel. By 1927, he was a blind inmate shadowboxing in the dirt. This wasn't a tragedy, it was a business model. Promoters used his body until his frontal lobe decayed. They bribed doctors to clear a schizophrenic man to fight. When an accident crushed his legs, syndicate lawyers legally stole his entire fortune. The industry drained every dollar from his skull. The second he became useless, they locked him in a cage and walked away. Adolphus Wolgast was born on February 8, 1888, in Cadillac, Michigan. Cadillac was a freezing timber town. The local economy relied entirely on cheap, expendable physical labor. His father, John Wolgast, worked the timber lines to support a large family. They lived in absolute poverty. There was no money for education. By age 16, Wolgast left the house to survive on his own. He worked the docks and the rail yards. In 1904, physical violence was the standard method to settle disputes among laborers. Wolgast learned to fight in the streets and alleys. He had no formal training. He never stepped inside a boxing academy. He had no coach to teach him the rules of the sport. Physically, he was a massive underdog. He was 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighed less than 130 pounds. In an unregulated street fight, size and mass dictate the winner. To survive, Wolgast developed a highly destructive, primitive tactic. He completely abandoned defense. He dropped his hands and intentionally used his forehead to absorb punches. He took heavy, concussive blows to the face just to get close enough to strike back. He traded brain cells for leverage. He fueled this fighting style with a strict carnivorous diet. He refused to consume vegetables. He ate thick cuts of heavy beef before and after physical exertion. He used this diet as a psychological weapon, publicly mocking other fighters, specifically vegetarians like Freddie Welsh, as biologically weak. The local underground gambling circuit noticed his durability. They branded him the Michigan Wildcat. On June 10, 1906, Wolgast took his first professional fight in Petoskey, Michigan. Boxing in 1906 was an unregulated, often illegal gambling operation. There were no athletic commissions. There were no safety standards. There were no mandatory medical suspensions. His opponent was Kid Moore. Moore stepped into the ring weighing 157 pounds. Wolgast weighed 130 pounds. Today, a 27-pound weight difference is illegal and strictly prohibited in combat sports. In 1906, it was just business. The bell rang. Wolgast did not back up. He walked straight into the heavier man. Moore landed massive punches directly to Wolgast's unprotected head. Wolgast absorbed the blunt force trauma without retreating. He stepped inside Moore's reach and repeatedly attacked Moore's ribs and liver. The shock of hitting a smaller man who refused to collapse broke Moore's will. After 6 rounds of taking severe head trauma, Wolgast won the decision on points. He received his first cash payout. He took the money, traveled back to Cadillac, and bought a farm for his parents. The transaction was established. Wolgast realized wealthy men would pay him cash to take extreme physical damage. The promoters realized they had a fighter who would never quit, no matter the cost to his health. The business arrangement was set. Wolgast traded his neurological future for a paycheck, and the promoters found a reliable asset. By July 1909, the boxing syndicate knew exactly what they had in Wolgast. He was not just a fighter, he was a highly reliable financial asset. He generated massive crowds because he guaranteed extreme violence. The promoters matched him against the reigning lightweight champion of the world, Battling Nelson. The fight took place in Los Angeles. After 10 brutal rounds, Wolgast clearly won on points. But the boxing industry was not a meritocracy. It was a closed financial loop. The local California boxing laws at the time did not recognize points decisions for championship titles. To take the belt, you had to kill or incapacitate the champion. Nelson kept his title. The promoters kept their champion. But the decision ignited public outrage. The public demanded a rematch. The promoters had successfully manipulated the system to double their profits. They had manufactured a storyline that would guarantee a record-breaking gate for a second fight. That second fight was finalized for February 22, 1910. It was scheduled for a maximum of 45 rounds. The location was Point Richmond, California. The promoters constructed the Richmond Arena specifically for this event. It was a massive wooden structure built entirely to house a one-night spectacle of human destruction. 15,000 men packed into the unventilated arena. They carried heavy cash. The gate receipts totaled exactly $37,750. In 1910, that was a staggering sum of money. The men sitting ringside, the bankers, the mobsters, and the casino operators did not care who won. They cared about the betting handle. Wolgast and Nelson were just two pieces of meat placed in the center of a massive gambling operation. Battling Nelson was a veteran of the unregulated circuit. He understood the psychological warfare required to break an opponent before the bell rang. Nelson entered the ring and deliberately stalled. He made Wolgast stand in his corner, shivering in the cold draft of the arena for 15 straight minutes. While Wolgast waited, Nelson stood at the ropes and finalized a massive side bet with the ringside gamblers. He wagered a heavy sum of his own money that he would knock Wolgast unconscious before the end of the 25th round. The confidence was absolute. Nelson and Wolgast then met in the center of the ring with referee Eddie Smith. The fighters proposed a dark, illegal agreement. They demanded that Smith completely disregard the rule book. They wanted all fouls ignored. No points deducted for headbutts. No warnings for low blows. Referee Smith agreed. The authorities ringside nodded. They sanctioned a 45-round fight to the death. The gloves used in 1910 were paper-thin. They were constructed of stiff, unpadded leather. They did not protect the fighters. They merely prevented the fighters' knuckles from shattering on impact. The fight began, and it immediately devolved into a back-alley slaughter. In the second round, Wolgast stepped inside Nelson's reach and fired a stiff, unpadded jab. The leather caught Nelson directly on the mouth, tearing the flesh open. The champion swallowed his own blood. In the third round, Nelson retaliated. He planted his feet and drove a straight right hand directly into the center of Wolgast's face. The cartilage in Wolgast's nose shattered. The bone snapped. Wolgast did not retreat. He swallowed the pain, stepped forward in the fourth round, and dug a left hook deep into Nelson's liver. The blunt force trauma to the organ was so severe it physically twisted Nelson's entire torso. By the fifth round, both men abandoned the sport of boxing entirely. They engaged in close-quarters trench warfare. The referee honored his corrupt agreement. He stood back and watched. They grabbed each other behind the neck and violently rammed their skulls together. They used the crowns of their heads to split the skin around their opponent's eyes. By the 10th round, the accumulation of trauma on Wolgast was visible. Repeated blunt force impact to the side of his head caused the cartilage in his ear to burst. His cauliflower ear tore open. Blood poured down his neck and chest. Nelson, the hardened veteran who had explicitly asked for a fight without rules, suddenly realized the fatal error of his contract. He was in the ring with a man who did not process fear or pain normally. During the 11th and 12th rounds, Nelson was subjected to repeated, vicious headbutts to the face. The champion actually turned to referee Eddie Smith and screamed, complaining about the lack of rules. The referee ignored him. The crowd cheered. The gambling syndicate demanded more blood. The physical toll of fighting uninterrupted for over 2 hours is catastrophic to the human body. Dehydration sets in. Muscles tear. Brain swelling begins. In the 22nd round, Nelson found his opening. He loaded his right hand and drove it flush into Wolgast's jaw. The kinetic impact severed Wolgast's equilibrium. He collapsed to the canvas like a felled tree. Nelson walked to a neutral corner and raised his hands, anticipating the collection of his massive side bet. But the human body of Wolgast defied standard biological limitations. He scraped himself off the wooden boards. He stood up on compromised legs and continued to fight. Round 25 arrived. This was the deadline for Nelson's side bet. Nelson rushed forward, desperate to secure the knockout and his money. Wolgast planted his feet and fired 3 consecutive right hands flush against Nelson's jaw. Nelson stumbled backward. The bell rang. The bet was lost. The financial blow broke Nelson's psychological resolve. The momentum permanently shifted. Wolgast became the aggressor. For the next 9 rounds, Wolgast systematically dismantled the champion. In round 34, Nelson did something he had never done in his career. He took a deliberate step backward. His body was failing. By round 35, Nelson's chest and shoulders were completely coated in his own blood. His vision was severely compromised due to the swelling around his eyes. In round 39, Wolgast trapped Nelson against the ropes. For 3 uninterrupted minutes, Wolgast rained heavy, concussive blows directly onto Nelson's unprotected skull. Referee Eddie Smith stepped in, looked at Nelson's ruined face, and begged him to quit. Nelson spat blood and refused. The end came in the 40th round. Nelson stepped out of his corner. He had no defense left. He dropped his arms to his sides. He stood in the center of the ring, acting as a stationary target. Wolgast stepped in to deliver the final execution. The referee finally intervened and called a technical knockout. The fight had lasted exactly 3 hours and 22 minutes. Nelson's face was unrecognizable. His nose was flattened against his cheeks. His left cheek was massively swollen from a hematoma. His mouth was shredded. Wolgast was declared the lightweight champion of the world. Back in Cadillac, Michigan, 4,000 people flooded the streets in a massive parade to celebrate their local hero. The promoters counted their massive profits. The gamblers collected their bets. But the clinical reality of February 22, 1910 was entirely ignored. Wolgast had just absorbed over 3 hours of repetitive, concussive brain trauma. He won a leather belt, but the fight initiated the irreversible destruction of his central nervous system. The capitalist machine got exactly what it paid for, and Wolgast paid the first installment of a fatal biological debt. By 1912, the name Wolgast no longer belonged to a human being. It was a corporate entity. He was a walking financial institution controlled entirely by California boxing syndicates, mobsters, and illegal gambling networks. The men who owned his contracts did not view him as an athlete. They viewed him as a high-yield asset. His willingness to absorb lethal amounts of physical punishment guaranteed massive crowds, which in turn guaranteed a massive betting handle. The boxing industry during this era was not governed by athletic commissions, focused on fighter safety. It was governed by casino capitalism. Champions were protected investments. The syndicates heavily manipulated rankings, bought off referees, and dictated the terms of every title defense to ensure the house never lost its money. The system operated on a rigid set of unwritten rules, the most prominent being the racial and ethnic manipulation of contenders. The establishment relied on white champions to drive the majority of the gambling revenue. Wolgast was the perfect product for this market. He was white, he was brutal, and he was champion. The syndicates insulated him from technical fighters who could outbox him and instead matched him against men who would stand and trade blunt force trauma, ensuring the bloody spectacle the gamblers paid to see. But maintaining this cash flow required Wolgast to fight constantly. His brain had never fully recovered from the 3.5-hour slaughter against Battling Nelson in 1910. The promoters did not care. They booked him on a relentless schedule. The neurological decay was accelerating, hidden behind closed gym doors, while the public was sold the image of an indestructible machine. The peak of this systemic corruption exploded on July 4, 1912. The promoters booked Wolgast to defend his lightweight title against a young, lethal Mexican-American challenger named Joe Rivers. The venue was the Vernon Arena. Vernon was not a standard city. It was a purpose-built municipality located just outside the Los Angeles city limits, designed specifically to evade the jurisdiction of strict LA law enforcement. Vernon was a company town built for vice. It was packed with saloons, brothels, and open-air gambling rings. The arena was the centerpiece of this operation. On Independence Day, thousands of bookies, syndicate bosses, and desperate gamblers packed into the wooden stadium. Millions of dollars in illegal wagers hinged on Wolgast retaining the title. The financial exposure for the mob was massive. They left nothing to chance. They installed Jack Welch as the referee. Welch was heavily embedded in the gambling infrastructure. His primary job was not to enforce the rules of boxing. His job was to protect the syndicate's investment. Joe Rivers was 20 years old. He was faster, sharper, and possessed devastating punching power. He was a legitimate threat to the establishment's cash flow. When the fight began, Rivers systematically took Wolgast apart. For 12 rounds, Rivers subjected the champion to a clinical, high-speed beating. Wolgast utilized his standard suicidal tactic, walking forward, taking heavy shots to the head, and trying to land a counter. But Rivers was too sharp. The damage accumulated rapidly. By the end of the 12th round, Wolgast's physical battery was completely empty. His face was a mask of blood. His legs were giving out. The kinetic energy required to keep his hands up was gone. Wolgast staggered back to his corner. He collapsed onto his stool. His central nervous system was failing. He looked at his handlers and signaled that he was finished. He wanted to quit. In a regulated sport, a trainer's duty is to stop the fight to prevent fatal injury. Wolgast's corner did not consist of trainers. They were asset managers. They were strictly ordered to keep the product on the floor until the final bell. His handler looked at the bleeding, exhausted champion, reached into his coat, and pulled out a heavy glass bottle. He shoved the glass directly into Wolgast's face. He explicitly threatened to smash Wolgast's skull open in the corner if he did not stand up and walk back into the center of the ring. The handler did not care if Rivers killed Wolgast in the 13th round. He only cared that Wolgast did not quit on the stool, which would instantly trigger a massive payout to the gamblers who bet on Rivers. Forced by the threat of immediate violence from his own team, Wolgast dragged his ruined body off the stool and stepped out for round 13. What followed remains one of the most blatant acts of organized fraud in sports history. Wolgast and Rivers met in the center of the ring. Both men were operating on pure adrenaline and survival instinct. They planted their feet. In a fraction of a second, they threw their heaviest punches simultaneously. The biomechanics aligned perfectly. Wolgast drove a left hook directly into Rivers' stomach. At the exact same millisecond, Rivers drove a crushing right-hand flush against Wolgast's jaw. The impact was simultaneous. The kinetic transfer instantly shut down the central nervous systems of both men. It was a double knockout. Wolgast and Rivers collapsed to the canvas at the exact same time. They lay entirely motionless, unconscious on the wooden floor. According to every established rule of combat sports, the fight was over. A double knockout dictates a draw or a no contest. If a draw was declared, Wolgast would technically retain his title, but the massive betting syndicates would face chaotic payouts and voided wagers. Referee Jack Welch immediately went to work for his employers. He did not wave the fight off. He sprinted over to the unconscious bodies. Welch reached down, grabbed Ad Wolgast by the armpit, and physically heaved the champion's limp body upward. He propped Wolgast up, balancing the unconscious man on his feet like a marionette. While holding Wolgast upright with his left hand, Welch pointed his right hand at the unconscious Joe Rivers and began counting him out. The timekeeper at ringside saw the corruption unfolding. He looked at his stopwatch. He began screaming and violently ringing the bell, indicating that the time for the 13th round had legally expired seconds before the punches were even thrown. The bell meant the fighters should have been sent to their corners. Welch completely ignored the timekeeper. He ignored the bell. He ignored the fact that he was physically holding up a comatose man. He reached the count of 10. He waved his hands and declared Joe Rivers the loser by knockout. He legally handed the victory to a man who was currently unconscious in his arms. The Vernon Arena erupted. The crowd realized they were witnessing an armed robbery without weapons. Thousands of enraged fans, particularly the Mexican-American supporters of Rivers who had just been robbed of their wagers, rioted. They tore apart the wooden seating. They stormed the ring. Referee Jack Welch dropped Wolgast's body, jumped out of the ring, and sprinted out of the arena under heavy police escort to escape being beaten to death by the mob. The aftermath proved the absolute power of the boxing cartel. Newspapers across the country printed photographs clearly showing Welch lifting Wolgast off the canvas. Investigative journalists documented the timekeeper's statement that the round had ended. The evidence of fixed gambling and referee manipulation was undeniable. Joe Rivers' management filed an immediate legal appeal. It meant nothing. The California boxing authorities and the political machine that backed them convened and officially upheld Jack Welch's decision. They officially recorded the fight as a 13th round knockout victory for Ad Wolgast. The syndicates collected their money. The casino capitalists protected their asset. Wolgast's brain had suffered another massive, concussive shutdown, but his handlers just packed him up and prepared him for the next payout. The system had tested its absolute limits of corruption, and it had won. The human brain is a fragile organ weighing roughly 3 pounds. It is entirely encased in bone and floats in a thin layer of cerebrospinal fluid. It is not designed for combat. When a human skull sustains a heavy concussive blow, the brain violently accelerates and crashes against the jagged interior walls of the cranium. Blood vessels tear. Brain tissue bruises. Microscopic nerve fibers snap. Unlike muscle or bone, the brain does not heal stronger after trauma. It scars. The damage is cumulative, progressive, and permanent. By the fall of 1912, Ad Wolgast had subjected his brain to thousands of these violent collisions. The unregulated boxing economy had extracted his physical capital. Now the biological bill was due. The structural collapse of Wolgast's central nervous system was not a sudden event. It was a methodical decay hidden by the promoters who owned his contracts. The first public catastrophic failure of his neurological hardware occurred on November 28, 1912. Wolgast was booked to defend his lightweight title against Willie Ritchie in Daly City, California. The gambling syndicates needed another massive payout. But the Wolgast that stepped into the ring that night was fundamentally altered. The frontal lobe of the brain controls judgment, impulse control, and spatial awareness. Wolgast's frontal lobe was severely compromised by blunt force trauma. When the bell rang, his autonomous control vanished. He could not calculate distance. He could not process the rules of engagement. Instead of fighting a tactical bout, his brain began to misfire violently. He repeatedly and uncontrollably threw heavy illegal strikes directly into Ritchie's groin. The referee issued multiple warnings. Wolgast could not process the commands. He continued the fouling. In the 16th round, the referee had no choice. He disqualified Wolgast. The fight was stopped. The lightweight title of the world was stripped away. In a regulated industry, this erratic, illegal behavior would trigger an immediate medical suspension and a thorough neurological evaluation. In the 1912 boxing cartel, a medical suspension meant lost revenue. The promoters did not view Wolgast as a patient suffering from neurodegeneration. They viewed him as a depreciating asset. He no longer held the championship belt, which meant his market value was dropping. To maximize their return on investment before he completely broke down, his management team radically accelerated his fight schedule. They decided to liquidate his remaining health for cash. The next 4 years became a highly organized, legally sanctioned torture program. The boxing syndicates pushed him into the ring constantly. There was no recovery time. By 1914, the physical rot had extended beyond his brain and into his skeletal system. On January 12, 1914, Wolgast was booked to fight Freddie Welsh at Madison Square Garden in New York. The New York athletic authorities were deeply embedded with the boxing promoters. Medical clearance was a rubber stamp process. Doctors paid by the promoters examined Wolgast and cleared him to fight, completely ignoring his obvious physical deterioration. During the bout with Welsh, the mechanical stress on Wolgast's body finally caused a structural failure. In the middle of the fight, Wolgast's right arm was struck. The bone fractured. The radial bone shattered completely. Wolgast continued to fight for multiple rounds with a severed bone grinding against muscle tissue. The pain induced physiological shock. In the 8th round, he collapsed onto his stool and could not stand up. He was forced to quit. The New York press, ignorant of the medical reality and manipulated by the promoters, labeled him a coward for quitting. They demanded a return on their ticket prices. The syndicate did not allow the bone to heal. Healing required time, and time cost money. In 1915, they dragged him out of recovery and forced him into a high-profile fight against Cy Smith. They mandated that he fight using the exact same right arm that was still fractured and suffering from severe structural weakness. Wolgast stepped into the ring as a handicapped man. He took another brutal beating. The authorities watched, collected their licensing fees, and looked the other way. The medical complicity was absolute. State-appointed doctors routinely falsified Wolgast's pre-fight physicals. They signed legal documents stating a man with a shattered arm and failing cognitive function was in perfect health. The physical mutilation reached its absolute peak in 1916. The promoters booked Wolgast to fight Chetneff in Seattle. The fight was another grueling high-trauma war of attrition. During the bout, Wolgast's ear was subjected to repetitive, heavy blunt force trauma. The cartilage was crushed. The blood supply to the tissue was entirely severed. The ear literally exploded under the impact. It was beaten into a shapeless, bloody mass of dead tissue. After the fight, the necrosis was so severe that surgeons had to perform radical reconstructive surgery. They essentially had to rebuild a human ear from scratch to prevent massive infection. The physical injuries were horrific, but the invisible damage was fatal. The clinical signs of a massive neurological collapse were now impossible to hide outside the ring. Wolgast began exhibiting the textbook symptoms of chronic traumatic encephalopathy, a disease caused by the buildup of tau protein in the brain following repeated concussions. At the time, the medical establishment called it dementia pugilistica. The fighters called it being punch drunk. Wolgast's cognitive function disintegrated. His speech became severely slurred and fragmented. He lost his short-term memory. He suffered from extreme spatial disorientation, often forgetting where he was or how he got there. Most dangerously, the destruction of his frontal lobe caused severe emotional volatility. He began suffering from unprovoked, highly violent outbursts. A private physician finally managed to examine him away from the corrupt syndicate doctors. The doctor issued a blunt, terrifying prognosis. He told Wolgast directly that his brain was degenerating. He explicitly warned him that if he took one more punch to the head, his brain would turn into a bowl of soup. Modern medical science has retroactively studied Wolgast's medical history. In his investigative book Damage, The Untold Story of Brain Trauma in Boxing, author Tris Dixon highlights Wolgast's clinical records. Dixon's research identifies Wolgast as one of the earliest, most severe, and most heavily documented cases of dementia pugilistica in the history of sports medicine. The medical evidence of his destruction was absolute. The promoters knew exactly what was happening. They saw the memory loss. They heard the slurred speech. They witnessed the violent paranoia. They were holding a medical death sentence in their hands. They completely ignored it. To the syndicate, Wolgast was not a patient. He was a brand name that still held equity. If his body was broken and his brain was dying, they simply needed to find a new way to keep him legally cleared to fight. The athletic commissions were already bought. The doctors were already bribed. The next step was to manipulate the United States legal system to ensure their heavily damaged asset could not escape the meat grinder. By 1917, the neurological destruction of Wolgast was absolute. The boxing syndicate could no longer hide his condition behind the closed doors of training camps. His cognitive collapse was public, volatile, and deeply undeniable. He was heavily symptomatic. He suffered from severe memory loss, aggressive paranoia, and total spatial disorientation. He was no longer a functioning human being. He was a medical emergency operating on basic survival instincts. The legal system was finally forced to intervene. The state of Wisconsin officially stepped in. A judge reviewed the medical evidence and issued a definitive ruling. Wolgast was declared legally incompetent due to severe mental decline. The court stripped him of his civil autonomy. He was no longer legally permitted to sign contracts, manage his finances, or agree to professional prize fights. His wife was appointed as his sole legal guardian. The state effectively declared his career over. It was a protective measure designed to save him from the industry that was actively killing him. The diagnosis deeply accelerated his psychological breakdown. In 1918, his condition mutated from severe cognitive impairment into acute paranoia and schizophrenia. He became intensely violent and unpredictable. His wife, unable to manage the physical danger of a brain-damaged professional fighter, was forced to commit him to a sanatorium. The facility was designed to keep him locked away from the public. But the primal, violent instincts that made him a world champion were still intact. Wolgast became highly agitated. He broke out of the psychiatric facility. He fled civilization entirely. Driven by severe paranoia and a shattered mind, the former lightweight champion of the world disappeared into the rugged, isolated wilderness of Northern California. He lived completely off the grid. He became a feral mountain man. He survived in the woods, disconnected from reality, hiding from the imaginary threats generated by his rotting frontal lobe. From a clinical and human perspective, this should have been the absolute end of the story. But the American boxing cartel did not view Ad Wolgast as a patient. They viewed him as stolen property. The name Ad Wolgast still possessed tremendous market value. The public was morbidly curious. The gambling syndicates knew that if they could get Wolgast back inside a ring, thousands of people would buy tickets just to see the wreckage of a former champion. The fact that he was clinically insane and legally incompetent was just a logistical hurdle. The promoters initiated a highly coordinated, heavily funded legal assault to reclaim their asset. They bypassed Wisconsin entirely. They targeted the legal jurisdiction of Los Angeles, California, a court system deeply entrenched in the political machinery of the gambling and vice syndicates. In late 1918, the Los Angeles courts executed a massive legal reversal. Using syndicate lawyers and heavy political pressure, the court abruptly overturned the Wisconsin ruling. The judge issued a new decree. He officially declared Ad Wolgast sane and fully capable of self-determination. The court immediately terminated his wife's legal guardianship. They completely ignored his medical history. They ignored his escape from the sanatorium. They ignored his feral existence in the mountains. With the stroke of a pen, the California legal system handed a severely brain-damaged man back to the cartel. This was not a legal procedure. It was organized medical fraud. It was a calculated crime engineered to extract the final remaining dollars from a dying brain. To legally sanction a fight, the state athletic commissions required medical clearance. The promoters simply bought the medical establishment. Corrupt physicians were placed on the syndicate payroll. They conducted sham physical examinations. They looked directly at a man suffering from advanced dementia pugilistica and signed official, state-stamped medical certificates declaring him in perfect physical and neurological health. They deliberately covered up his schizophrenia. When Wolgast was too heavily sedated or too erratic to function, the handlers injected him with stimulants to artificially prop him up for public appearances. They dragged the broken machine back across the ropes. The final stage of his career was not a sport, it was a public execution. Wolgast stepped into the ring completely hollowed out. His eyes were vacant. The complex neural pathways required to block a punch, gauge distance, or formulate a strategy were completely destroyed. He stood flat-footed. He offered zero defense. He was placed in the ring against young, hungry, heavy-hitting prospects who were looking to build their resumes by knocking out a famous name. These younger fighters used the former world champion for live target practice. They unloaded maximum kinetic force onto a skull that was already irreparably compromised. The sensory overload of the arena terrified his damaged mind. Sometimes, in the middle of a brutal exchange, Wolgast's brain would simply shut down. He would forget where he was. He would drop his hands, turn his back on his opponent, and aimlessly wander around the canvas in a state of deep confusion. The referees, completely bought and paid for by the same men organizing the fights, did not stop the bouts. They watched a mentally disabled man receive severe concussions and let the clock run. The authorities looked the other way. The crowds placed side bets on how many rounds the zombie could remain standing. The capitalist machinery stripped away his last shred of human dignity, converting his absolute cognitive collapse into a steady stream of gambling revenue. By the early 1920s, Ad Wolgast was completely stripped of his utility as an active fighter. He could no longer be legally or illegally sanctioned to step into a ring. His brain was too damaged to even serve as a punching bag for prospects. He was a biological ruin. The boxing syndicates that had engineered his destruction immediately abandoned him. When the revenue stream stops, the cartel moves on. But the American sports economy is incredibly efficient. If a product cannot be sold directly, its residual value is recycled. Wolgast was no longer a fighter, but he was still a famous brand. Enter Jack Doyle. Doyle was a highly influential California boxing promoter, a political power broker, and the owner of the Vernon Arena gym. Doyle recognized an unexploited revenue stream. He stepped into the legal vacuum left by Wolgast's previous handlers and officially assumed the role of Wolgast's guardian. Doyle's guardianship was not a medical intervention. It was a hostile corporate takeover of a broken human being. Doyle did not place Wolgast in a specialized neurological clinic. He did not hire physical therapists or psychiatrists to manage the severe dementia. Instead, Doyle locked Wolgast inside the central training quarters of the Vernon Arena. He transformed the former lightweight champion of the world into a living, breathing billboard. Doyle weaponized Wolgast's insanity to sell gym memberships. Every day, Doyle forced the severely brain-damaged man to put on his training gear. He positioned Wolgast in the center of the gym, directly in front of the crowds of paying customers, journalists, and aspiring fighters. Doyle ordered Wolgast to shadowbox. He made him skip rope. He made him punch the heavy bag. Doyle actively fed Wolgast delusions, telling him that a massive championship rematch with battling Nelson was just weeks away. The crowds paid admission just to watch the spectacle. They stood around the ring and stared at the shell of a man who used to rule the lightweight division. They watched a mentally disabled man mumble to himself, strike at invisible opponents, and prepare for a fight that did not exist. Wolgast was completely unaware of the humiliation. His destroyed frontal lobe shielded him from reality. He genuinely believed he was in peak physical condition. Doyle monetized this tragic disconnect. He collected the entry fees, used the famous name to draw high-profile clients to his facility, and provided Wolgast with nothing but a cot in the back room and basic rations. The system had downgraded Wolgast from a high-yield combat asset to a sideshow freak. This daily routine of exploitation continued until the physical environment violently collided with Wolgast's shattered reality. The date was early 1920. The location was Spring Street, deep in the industrial heart of Los Angeles. Boxers maintain a rigid, highly specific biological rhythm. They wake up before dawn to do road work. It is deeply ingrained in the muscle memory of the athlete. Wolgast's brain was misfiring, but his muscle memory was fully intact. Believing he was deep in a grueling training camp for the Phantom Nelson fight, Wolgast woke up at 5 a.m. He left the gym. He began running down the center of Spring Street in the pitch dark. He was completely disconnected from his physical surroundings, lost in a psychological loop from 1910. Los Angeles in 1920 was dominated by the Pacific Electric Railway. Massive, heavy steel streetcars operated on fixed tracks directly down the center of the avenues. The streetcar drivers operated on tight schedules with limited visibility in the early morning fog. Wolgast did not hear the warning bells. He did not process the massive headlights cutting through the dark. He just kept running his roadwork on the tracks. The streetcar struck him head-on. The kinetic transfer of a multi-ton steel streetcar hitting a human body at speed is highly destructive. Wolgast was thrown violently onto the pavement. The massive steel wheels did not decapitate him, but the blunt force impact completely crushed his lower extremities. Both of his legs were shattered. The femurs, tibias, and fibulas were fractured into multiple pieces. The bones tore through the muscle tissue. The physical machine that had carried him through 40-round bloodbaths was permanently demolished. He was rushed to a local Los Angeles emergency room. The physical trauma was catastrophic, but the psychological reaction was terrifying. When local sports reporters heard the news, they rushed to the hospital to get the story. They walked into the ward, expecting to find a man in agonizing pain, reckoning with the end of his physical mobility. Instead, they found a horror show of cognitive dissonance. Wolgast was lying in the hospital bed, his crushed legs elevated and wrapped in heavy plaster casts, immobilized by traction pulleys. He was heavily sedated, yet completely animated. When the reporters approached his bed, Wolgast looked at them and burst into laughter. The severe brain damage completely overrode his nervous system's pain receptors. He pointed to his shattered legs and confidently told the journalists that the accident was just a minor setback. He explicitly stated, with total conviction, that he was simply resting his legs before the training camp resumed. He looked directly into the cameras and promised that he was going to knock battling Nelson unconscious in their upcoming bout. The reporters wrote down his quotes verbatim. The newspapers printed them the next day. The public consumed the story as a dark comedy. No one held the promoters accountable. No one questioned why a severely mentally ill man was allowed to run unsupervised in traffic. The system simply extracted the final drop of publicity from his shattered femurs. While Wolgast lay immobilized and delusional in the hospital ward, the financial vultures initiated the final extraction phase. During his peak earning years, Wolgast had accumulated a massive fortune. He had generated hundreds of thousands of dollars in purses and illegal side bets. He owned valuable real estate, including the farm in Michigan and various properties. But a man with advanced dementia cannot manage a financial portfolio. The legal mechanism of conservatorship in the 1920s was highly unregulated. It was a tool frequently used by corrupt lawyers and syndicate bosses to strip mine the assets of incapacitated individuals. While Wolgast was locked in his delusions, a highly coordinated network of former managers, fraudulent legal guardians, and predatory attorneys systematically drained his accounts. They forged signatures. They transferred property deeds. They liquidated his real estate. They billed massive, fabricated administrative fees to his estate. They looted his entire life's work with absolute legal impunity. By the time Wolgast's legs healed enough for him to limp out of the hospital, the bank accounts were empty. He was reduced to absolute grinding poverty. He did not own a single asset. He was entirely dependent on Jack Doyle for his daily survival. The financial wipeout was total. The boxing cartel had paid him blood money to destroy his brain, and once the brain was destroyed, their lawyers legally stole the money back. Doyle took Wolgast back to the Vernon Arena. Wolgast was now blind in one eye, crippled and completely broke. Doyle continued to use him as a prop, but the dynamic had shifted. Wolgast was no longer just delusional, he was becoming highly unstable. The paranoia was accelerating. The damage to his frontal lobe meant he could not control aggressive impulses. The breaking point arrived in September 1927. The catalyst was a ghost from his past. Willie Ritchie walked into the Vernon gym. Willie Ritchie was the man who had officially taken the lightweight title from Wolgast on November 28, 1912, during the fight where Wolgast's brain first misfired and caused him to repeatedly foul. Ritchie was visiting the gym for routine boxing business. He walked onto the floor. Wolgast was sweeping the floors or shadowboxing in the corner. His failing eyes locked onto Ritchie's face. The damaged neurons in Wolgast's brain instantly bridged a 15-year gap. The visual stimulus of Ritchie bypassed his dementia and triggered a massive, primal surge of adrenaline. The brain damage completely erased any concept of time, location, or consequence. Wolgast did not see a retired fighter visiting a gym in 1927. He saw the man trying to take his belt in 1912. Wolgast snapped. He emitted a feral scream, dropped what he was holding, and launched a violent, unprovoked physical assault directly at Ritchie. The crippled, half-blind former champion threw himself at his old rival, throwing heavy, erratic punches, trying desperately to knock him out. The gym erupted into chaos. Trainers and fighters had to physically tackle Wolgast to the floor to stop the assault. Wolgast fought against the restraints like a wild animal, screaming about the title. Jack Doyle stood back and calculated the situation. The math was simple. Wolgast was no longer a profitable sideshow. He was now a massive legal and physical liability. If Wolgast seriously injured a paying customer or another fighter, Doyle would be held financially responsible. The asset had officially depreciated into a threat. Doyle did not hesitate. He did not seek psychiatric help for his ward. He immediately contacted the California legal authorities. He filed the paperwork to have Ad Wolgast permanently removed from society. Doyle testified that the man he had been exploiting for years was now an uncontrollable menace. The court agreed. In late 1927, the state of California issued a mandatory committal order. They dispatched law enforcement to physically detain the former lightweight champion of the world. Ad Wolgast was loaded into a transport vehicle and driven to the Stockton State Hospital. Stockton was a massive Gothic psychiatric institution designed to warehouse the incurable. It was a terminal destination. The authorities walked Wolgast through the heavy iron doors. They stripped him of his clothes. They placed him in a locked ward. The heavy doors slammed shut and the lock turned. The institutionalization was not a medical intervention. It was a permanent disposal strategy for a depreciated asset. Jack Doyle and the California syndicates had successfully transferred their financial liability onto the taxpayers. The heavy iron doors of Stockton State Hospital slammed shut, completely severing Wolgast from the outside world. He was stripped of his remaining dignity and issued a standard asylum uniform. Ad Wolgast belonged entirely to the state now, while the boxing cartel simply scouted the industrial slums for their next high-yield investment. That transition in the fall of 1927 was not a temporary medical hold. It was a permanent burial. In the 1920s, a state psychiatric institution was not a facility designed for neurological rehabilitation. It was a terminal warehouse. It was built to hold the incurable, the violent, and the unwanted away from public view. Wolgast was 39 years old. His boxing career had officially ended years prior, but the biological consequences of that career were now his permanent reality. He would spend the next 28 years of his life locked inside this system. Inside the asylum, the physical degradation accelerated. The thousands of heavy, concussive blows Wolgast had absorbed to his frontal bone and orbital sockets finally claimed their ultimate toll. The internal scarring and nerve damage severed his optic connections. Wolgast went completely blind. The physical world went permanently dark. He was stripped of his wealth, his freedom, his sanity, and finally his sight. Yet the central nervous system is a terrifyingly resilient machine. Wolgast's cognitive mind was completely destroyed by dementia pugilistica, but his muscle memory was permanently hardwired. His body refused to shut down. The clinical staff at Stockton documented a horrifying daily routine. Every morning, the blind, heavily scarred former champion would dress in a pair of faded athletic shorts. He would navigate the dirt courtyard of the locked ward by memory and instinct. He would begin to run laps. He ran for hours. He stopped only to violently shadowbox against invisible opponents. He threw perfect, mechanically sound hooks and crosses into the empty air. When the psychiatric nurses or orderlies approached him, they found a man completely detached from the present decade. If they asked him what he was doing, he smiled with extreme confidence. He told them he was in the final stages of a brutal training camp. He explicitly stated he was preparing to defend his lightweight championship of the world against battling Nelson. He was trapped in a permanent neurological loop of February 22, 1910. The trauma of that 40-round bloodbath was so severe it had burned itself into his ruined brain as his only remaining reality. The medical staff routinely checked his vitals. They recorded a resting heart rate of exactly 40 beats per minute. This was not the pulse of a dying man. It was the clinical bradycardia of an elite extreme endurance athlete. His heart was still conditioned for a 40-round war, but his brain was entirely gone. He was a biological ghost. This horrifying existence did not go undocumented by the outside world. Before Wolgast was permanently locked away, his exact physical and mental state was closely observed by a young writer named Ernest Hemingway. Hemingway was obsessed with the brutal, unfiltered reality of blood sports. He did not care about the glamorized, heroic narratives sold by the boxing promoters. He cared about the damage. In 1925, Hemingway published a short story titled The Battler. It stands as one of the most clinically accurate literary depictions of chronic traumatic encephalopathy ever written. Hemingway did not invent the tragedy of his story. He lifted it directly from the shattered reality of Ad Wolgast. The story features a character named Ad Francis, a former boxing champion wandering the country, deeply brain-damaged and highly volatile. Hemingway's physical description of the character was a forensic mirror of Wolgast. He described a face that looked like crushed clay. He detailed a flattened nose, eyes narrowed into tiny slits by years of scar tissue, and misshapen lips. He specifically described one ear that was a thick cauliflower mass, and another ear that was entirely mutilated and reduced to a stump, the exact reconstructive reality Wolgast faced after his 1916 fight in Seattle. Hemingway even included the clinical detail of the fighter's abnormally slow heart rate, directly citing the 40 beats per minute pulse. Hemingway proudly confirmed to fellow writers that Ad Wolgast was the absolute prototype for the character. But the most chilling aspect of Hemingway's documentation was not the physical description, it was the psychological dynamic. In the story, the brain-damaged fighter is managed by a handler named Bugs. Bugs is polite, calm, and deeply menacing. When the fighter inevitably suffers a paranoid, violent delusion and attempts to attack someone, Bugs does not try to calm him down medically. He simply steps behind the fighter, pulls out a blackjack, a heavy leather club filled with lead, and strikes the champion strictly at the base of the skull. The fighter drops unconscious. Bugs casually wipes the fighter's face with a wet cloth and pulls his mutilated ear to wake him up, ready to move on to the next town. Hemingway used this interaction to expose the exact mechanics of the boxing industry. The blackjack was the perfect metaphor for the cartel. The promoters, the managers, and the handlers did not care about the neurological health of their assets. They controlled broken men through blunt force, exploitation, and absolute dominance. They kept the fighters functioning just enough to be useful, and knocked them out when they became a liability. For Ad Wolgast, there was no handler left to wake him up. The cartel had already extracted millions of dollars from his skull. They had bought their mansions and expanded their casino operations. They never visited the asylum. In the early 1950s, Wolgast was transferred to the Camarillo State Mental Hospital in Southern California. The world outside the hospital walls had completely transformed. The brutal 40-round, unregulated, bare-knuckle era that built him was ancient history. Boxing was now broadcast on television. Athletic commissions enforced mandatory medical suspensions. Referees stopped fights at the first sign of severe trauma. The modern sports economy had sanitized the violence for corporate sponsors. Ad Wolgast remained in the dark, running his laps, throwing his punches at a ghost from 1910. The human engine finally failed on April 14, 1955. Ad Wolgast suffered massive heart failure in his ward at Camarillo. He was 67 years old. There was no public mourning. There was no grand parade in Cadillac, Michigan. The man who died in 1955 was just an empty biological shell. The actual Ad Wolgast, the consciousness, the autonomy, the human being, had been methodically executed by the boxing industry decades earlier. The case of Ad Wolgast is not a tragedy of bad luck. It is a documented record of a flawless capitalist extraction. The system operated exactly as it was designed. It identified a desperate, impoverished kid with a lethal tolerance for pain. It weaponized his trauma. It placed him in a ring and monetized his brain cells. It corrupted the legal and medical institutions to keep him fighting when he was clinically insane. It deployed lawyers to legally steal his remaining wealth. And when there was absolutely nothing left to take, it locked him in a cage to die in the dark.